Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the latest talk in the Australian War Memorials History webinar series. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting on today. My name is Megan Adams, and I am a historian in the Military History section here at the Australian War Memorial. This morning, we will be hearing from Dr David Stahel. David is an Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. His research has focused on the German Army in the Second World War, especially Hitler's war in the East against the Soviet Union. He has written numerous books, including 6 published with Cambridge University Press. His latest book, titled Hitler's Panzer Generals, was published in 2023. It is from this recent study that we will be hearing from today. I will now pass over to you, David. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan, and thank you all very much for tuning in. It's a real pleasure to get the opportunity to talk about my research. And today, as you can see behind me, I'm going to be basing this off a book that's just come out looking at Hitler's Panzer Generals, but perhaps more specifically, I've chosen to focus on Heinz Guderian and, as the other photo there suggests, his wife Margarete. And I think this is really important for an Anglo-American audience. Heinz is probably the best known of the Panzer Generals, but the book is looking at a bigger cohort. It's looking at men who achieved the rank of Panzer Group Commander, which is the highest formation of tank kind of small armies, you might say, that are operating on the Eastern Front. So these are all very important men. And the book was basically, if anyone knows the background of my research, they might say, well, you've been working on a lot of these operational histories, David. What would then lead you to work on a book explicitly about the generals? Like, haven't you already covered that? You talk about them all the time. I think that the key point there at the beginning I'd like to say is this book is based on their private letters, which is a resource, I have to say, even after all the years I've spent researching these men, when I finally got to read the letters, and that might strike people as strange in itself, like, haven't you read their letters before? Well, there's a bit of a story to that, but I'll start with that in a moment. When you get the letters, you suddenly realize 2 things. One, there's a completely different dimension to who these men were. And this book is very much about that side of it. Like, who are the men beyond the generals? Beyond the uniform. So we've talked about operations, we've talked about campaigns and such things, but I really wanted to try and piece together who are they as private individuals? How are their careers so successful? And everything that those letters inform basically drove me to this idea, I've got to do a whole book on this. And I want to zero in on Heinz because A, he's probably the best known, but also, as you can see up there, his wife Margarete is a really important voice for 2 reasons. One, we have, believe it or not, no information, none that I'm aware of, none that anyone I could ever talk to in my various circles who knew anything about anything published on German generals' wives. And we have no primary material from any of them. So when I was in Guderian's private papers, this is where I discovered Margarete's letters. And we don't have a lot of them. There's only 13 for 1941. But they are absolute gold. This is not something some people have said to me, oh, you're just including women to be PC or something. That is absolutely rubbish. She is integral to the success of a man like Guderian. And given she's the only one we have an insight into, because all my other Panzer generals, I got their letters to do the book, but I had nothing, not a single word from their wives. But if Margarete is anything to go on, it's just so interesting what role she plays in supporting Heinz. So we'll look at that as we get in. So this first slide that I want to do, it speaks to the problem that I alluded to a moment ago. Why wouldn't we be looking at these letters? And here's a remarkable thing that a lot of people find almost unbelievable. Germans can't read these letters usually without some kind of training. And you might say, well, what do you mean? It's in German, isn't it? And maybe it's just because they think handwriting's hard to read. That can also be the case for, reading English letters. The difference here is German boys, in this case, or girls, in the late 19th century were working with a different alphabet. So if you imagine Germany as this sort of mixture from going back before the 19th century of a whole bunch of disparate small principalities and duchies and kingdoms, because Germany wasn't Germany yet, the education systems weren't uniform in how to form letters. So that just meant that the evolution of all these education systems allowed people to form in these different areas the letters in different ways. And there was only writing reforms that came on at the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, something called Zitterlin, but that was only for Prussia, that tried to uniform this process. But of course, our German generals as young boys, or Margarete, they were learning these old systems. It just means that when we get their letters, you have to key your eye in to how they're using the letters. And I think I've put up there on the top, it was a few months ago, I put this slide together. I think that's the Zitterlin. So basically, you don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but if you were to look, you would start to realize that, look how they form an S, or look how they form a G. It just doesn't look like the kinds of letters as we might know them from the alphabet. That just complicates the process. The other thing I thought there is I put up Margarete's, her handwriting is actually sort of hard, but then in cases, and this is not the only letter, it's written over the letter. So there's a real issue with using these. And back in the day when I was a graduate student discovering all these collections and so on, the other thing you have to imagine is the Eastern Front is by far the largest part of the German army's experience, and there is a plethora. Think of warehouses filled with files, right? When you have an army of more than 3 million men, the amount of paper that generates is astonishing. And then when you look at these letters, they're a wonderful resource in and of themselves, but there was two problems. One, you would have to have a lot of money to be able to transcribe these letters and then to translate them. And I thought to myself, well, I've got all the army command files anyway, and there's a special ordinance in the German army that is very clear about what you are allowed to write in letters going home and what you are not allowed to write. And the basic bottom line to that is a lot of things are excluded, not surprisingly. Operational details are not allowed. And these are for everyday soldiers. You can't mention where you are. You can't mention anyone you're talking to in your command or anything. So who your senior officer is or anything. So I always assumed, well, if I was to spend all the money transcribing all these letters, they would have no operational detail in them because you're not allowed to. Well, years later, when I finally did bother, I would like to read these letters. I transcribed them. I suddenly realized the German generals weren't paying any attention to that. And even though there was a censor that was supposed to control what's going home, the German generals weren't subject to that. They were beyond that censor. So the kind of nice part was when I finally got to read them, I realized there's a whole separate book that we can engage with. And that's what I want to do today. I want to talk about first Margarete, and then Heinz Guderian. And again, it's going to be focused very much on the letters, but it really underscores how important these collections are because it transforms what we previously knew about these people. So to begin with, Margarete, you can see her there. I want to frame this in two different ways. I want to talk about sort of managing family. So what is their role, but also this violence. They're involved in war. That's why we're interested in them. And it says a lot about their character as well as their importance. So the first thing I want to share, and I'll read this out to you, it's how Margarete is writing in her letter to Heinz, how she sees herself. This is, I think, really important. And she, in many ways in this passage, fits that National Socialist ethos of who the woman is. She knows what that is, and she's playing to that. So she writes, I dare not allow myself to think too much about the events of the war. Above all, not about the infinitely great tasks you are repeatedly given to solve in the war zone. That fits very well with what a lot of historians who have been charting the role of the women in the Third Reich, this is how they're supposed to behave. This is how they're supposed to be. Very much homemakers and really of no consequence to the important matters of the war. Again, Margarete knows this, and she has lines in the letters that underscore that she's aware of this. I'll put one more up there, and I think this is really important because it is probably the starting point for what a lot of people would say in, well, why would you focus on her? In a sense, this book has four major German generals, but there's a fifth character there. It's Guderian's wife, and there's good reason for that. Partly because we don't have that voice, but again, the kind of big reveal, what is her real role in this, and how important is that? So another one of these quotations, she says, and this really speaks to the point, she says, she even refers at one point to her purpose and aim of my vocation as a woman. That's how she describes her support for Heinz, right? That's the purpose and aim of my vocation as a woman. It's all about supporting my husband. But you could take that not just as being a wife and support in that sense. It turns out she's absolutely integral to him in a military capacity. So the other photo on the slide is, it's just a little bit confusing. It's Heinz Günther Guderian, so he has his father's name, but I'll refer to him as Heinz Günther. That's their eldest son. And he's also an officer in the Second World War. He's actually in 1941 on the Eastern Front serving. Actually, so is his brother. So they've only got 2 kids, but all 3, Heinz Guderian, Heinz Günther, and Kurt Guderian, they're all in the East. They're all fighting. And years after the war, Heinz Günther is going to not just serve in the Second World War in the German army, but he'll join the Bundeswehr. He'll have a stellar career. He'll become a general. He'll even have the same role that his father had in the Second World War of Inspector General of Panzer Troops. He'll have that in the German Bundeswehr. So he's a very accomplished, very successful German general in both the war and the post-war era. After his career has ended, he's talking to a biographer in the 1970s, and one of the things that it was written down in that book is that he's talking about his mother, and he uses the term, yeah, she acted for my father like his chief of staff. And that immediately piqued my interest, even some years ago before I had access to Margarete's letters, because it didn't seem like a term that a very accomplished German military officer would use in any kind of frivolous or offhanded way. The chief of staff is an absolutely prime military position that the best of the best aspire to and achieve. Calling his mother a chief of staff to Heinz Guderian, that's already very interesting. And now we go back to the letters and we start to look at that side. So in one of the letters that she has, this is towards the end of December 1941, and I need to first set this up a little bit. We've got a picture up there. One is obviously Hitler. The other one is a guy named Brauchitsch, and he is the commander-in-chief of the German army. So really important guy. And if some of you are saying, oh, I don't know much about Brauchitsch, yeah, that's okay. Not very much is written about him. He's obviously very important. He's at the top of that pinnacle, that sort of pyramid, but in many respects, he's picked because he's a weak character. This is what appeals to Hitler. Makes him perfect for the job because you can browbeat the guy and he's not going to be this big personality. So even though he looks like he's really important, in fact, there's only one biography that's ever been written about him. Maybe that also speaks to his sort of, the fact that he's not really the key man. If you'd have to pick a key man, it's probably the chief of the Army General Staff, a guy named Franz Halder. But in any case, Brauchitsch is there and he's really key. And at this point in the war, just when Margarete writes this letter, he's just been fired. I mean, he was a bit of a doormat anyway. People walked all over him. People bypassed him. He'd actually just had a heart attack in November. And the other thing that's happening in the war, of course, is at this point the Soviets are launching their great counteroffensive in front of Moscow, and Hitler needs a scapegoat. So Brauchitsch is gone. Now, in this period, this is what Margarete writes to Heinz, and it speaks to this idea of just who she really is. It's not those quotations that we saw before. I think this is the real Margarete. This Christmas surprise with von Brauchitsch getting his marching orders caused quite a stir. There are rumours circulating about 7 other generals. That's the first part. I'll stop there. She's living in Berlin. She lives in the exclusive suburb where all the Nazi elite live. Himmler's house is just down the road. She is not a homemaker who's just managing things on the home front, keeping a house. She is going to all the key parties and dinners and such things. She represents her husband, and she critically has her ear to the ground. That's how she knows this kind of stuff. That's how she knows there's 7 other generals in play. She's listening, she's gathering information, and she's passing it on to Heinz. She continues. She's just talked about these rumors. If they're true, events will have taken a turn that we feared. I don't want to go into any more detail in writing, but you'll understand what I mean. On the telephone recently, I also didn't want to ask. We can speak about it in more depth later. I'll stop again there. She's extremely aware of the politics. She knows that I can't be seen to be playing in this role, and this is all far too sensitive. Letters are, of course, even if they're not going through an open system, because largely they're not. Sometimes she does actually send letters through the postal system, but there's a lot of couriers going between the front and Berlin, and they know the right people, and they're just giving them to officers, and this is how they're sending a lot of letters. So they're not subject to the censor anyway, but they've got a very direct form of transmission. But she still doesn't trust it. That's because she's smart, And you might say, what about on the telephone, right? They could talk at least there because they are having these conversations. That's not how the telephones worked at that time. When you called into a command, it's actually perfectly normal for other people in the command just pick up the receiver and listen in on the call. There's also operators, and of course there's Gestapo and so on. I'm not sure how much that's in their mind, but that's of course another potential method for people to listen in. So she knows not to trust any of this. And she's so integral and these plans are so sensitive, she's waiting for better opportunities to do it. But then the key part, and I'll continue and I'll put that in blue up there to make it really explicit. There will also be changes and consequences for your activities and tasks. Who's communicating that? She's telling him what he's going to have to do, and he very much defers to his wife on these matters. I hope with all my heart it will turn out for the best. You know how profoundly I experience and share everything with you. This goes back to Heinz Gunther's point. She is his chief of staff. She is not some innocent bystander woman on the home front with no knowledge or no role. She's very, very much involved in the politics. She's gathering the information, but she has a lot of ideas and she supports Heinz. Now, we don't have a lot of time in a webinar like this to really go into Margarete and talk about lots of different instances, but if anyone knows his bio quite well, you'll know that at this point in the war, he's just about to be fired. And won't go into really why, but he's then going to be in a period where he's trying to rebuild his career. And again, if we had more time, again, Margarete shows up as being integral to that process. So again, what I think is so fascinating is, on the one hand, we know nothing about German generals' wives. So we really don't even know where to start with what is their role, but we get insight into one and we see, I would think she must almost be exceptional, but I don't know that she's exceptional in playing such an important role. So again, if the ethos is, well, Nazi German state, women were always very much, homemakers and secondary, turns out in the one instance we have in German capacity, that is absolutely not the case. And I just put this in here quickly, D. Almeida, who's done a lot of studies on the sort of the leading circles of the Nazi state, very, very good book. And it's written in there, the actions of the wives of male members of this inner sanctum should not be overlooked. He's probably focusing much more on Nazi elite, so industry people or party people, but it would apply very much to the German generals' wives. In most cases, they were surprisingly well informed and used their own celebrity to work in favor of their husbands and friends. Absolutely true. Maybe one last final point on that. Again, this book was about more German generals. At one point, one of these guys, Reinhardt, who's also a Panzer Group commander, very important man, he's just received a letter from his wife. We don't have it, but what we have is his letter. And he responds. His wife has basically written something about, I'm very worried about you going up to the front all the time, because she can see him in the newsreels and in these kinds of things. And he writes about it. And then he writes a letter that's a real rebuke. He basically says, you cannot tell me what to do because you need to represent me. And I cannot have a wife on the home front who is behaving overly emotional about it. You need to be stoic and strong, and you need to be this person because he understands she represents him at these kinds of events, such as she's going to them. Eva, that's Reinhardt's wife, is not actually in Berlin, so I don't know how much she does, but it's a clear understanding of how important wives can be and how they need to behave because they represent them. And then I thought what I'd do here is talk a little bit about, again, Margarete's role. It's not just that she's this really key person in advising Heinz, she plays a whole other role. And it's to do with the emotional support, which would be, I think, generalizable to almost all the German generals' wives. Again, there's a quotation that talks to this. It is with the greatest sympathy that we are thinking of you in terrible, wintry Russia, and we are grateful and ashamed that we are permitted to have nice, warm, well-kept homes. This also speaks to that sort of confluence between front and Heimat. So the whole idea of National Socialism is we don't have soldiers at the front doing all the hard work and then all these privileged civilians. No, civilians need to suffer too, because in a sense, how dare they enjoy a higher standard of living? And this comes into the rhetoric, but it also informs the mindset of people like Margarete to be absolutely shoulder to shoulder. Whatever my husband needs or my sons, I will play that role. I am there for them. And the big thing that we'll see when we get to, I think, the next slide is the important role that Margarete plays in emotional support for Heinz. That might strike you as a bit odd because you might say, oh, men of this era, they were, true men, very, very, and people like Guderian, this is what the propaganda image, this strong, bold, dashing panzer commander who leads everywhere, and all the photos of him are this, smiling, confident guy. That is absolutely not who Guderian is. Absolutely not. And we can categorically say that because you can trace it through his letters. In fact, I spoke to a psychologist who had access to these letters, and her determination was this man sounds clinically depressed. And I think a lot of evidence supports that. Not just even in his letters, people who were meeting him by November and December are writing about this man as, one of the expressions was, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I think the expression is a Gummilöwe. So he's talking about a rubber lion. So this idea that, is this great facade, but the guy I'm meeting is a broken man. And that's, I think, very much who Guderian is at this point. Now, I put up a slide there of Kurt Guderian. That's their youngest son. And this is perhaps my final point on Margarete, because I don't want to get ahead of myself on time here. Basically, the context for this little passage that I've just put up there at the very bottom is she hasn't had a letter from Kurt in many, many weeks. I can't remember how many weeks, but she's worried. She's written once or twice to Heinz saying, look, I haven't heard from Kurt. He's up near Leningrad, and she's worried. And then a letter arrives from Kurt, which is actually intended for Heinz Günther. I think what he's figured out is sending letters on the Eastern Front from one point to the other is not very efficient. If I send it home to Mum, Mum can forward it on. But this letter's turned up. She's far too curious. So she's opened it, and what she does, the only reason we have this is because she copies out this section and puts it in a letter to Heinz, so we have it. Now, maybe I shouldn't spend too much time reading it out, but basically if you have a read of what's up there, he's in a harrowing position, right? Large casualties in his unit. It's been extremely difficult. They've lost a lot of equipment. They've been in a very tense environment. And this is very much the story of junior officers on the Eastern Front in 1941. This is a dangerous war to be in. This is high-intensity conflict. Casualties, especially among junior officers, are extremely high. And now Margarete is getting an insight into it. But I think the really important point, and the reason I include it in here, is if we're trying to get a picture of who is Margarete, what I can't really answer for the audience, but when I have that passage, I also have the rest of the letter. And what's fascinating is, on the one hand, she's copying this out to Heinz saying, look, we've got word from Kurt, and this is what he's going through, so you can see. And then the letter immediately transitions into, and Auntie Bessie was staying with us, and it was a wonderful trip. She's doing way too much. And she's busy with this, and she's busy with that. And then we took her to the train station, and what luck, we got her a window seat. And what I can't get over is, on the one hand, her youngest son is exposed to mortal danger. And then almost in the next paragraph, I don't know if she wrote the letter in different phases or so, but it's this remarkable juxtaposition between the extraordinary and the mundane put together. Now, the big question there is that just who a National Socialist wife is? Are you able to do what we would find squaring circles? On the one hand, well, you just transition, don't you? You just got to get on with life. You just have to accept that this is what men do. And they've been doing it for months now, so you move on. And you don't become overly emotional and all those kinds of things. Or is it, no, she is absolutely terrified by what this is, but in the National Socialist ethos, you might do what they call perform resilience, right? I can't answer that question. I don't know which is the real Margarete, but there's enough in those letters to suggest both, I guess. On the one hand, she's citing it, and she's clearly expressed, I'm worried about these letters aren't turning up anymore. Where's Kurt? Have you heard anything? And at the same time, when we finally get evidence of shocking danger, she then immediately transitions into everything else and ends the letter as normal, and it seems like that's just what she does. Remarkable. And again, underscores how important further research into who these women are. And maybe as a final slide on Margarete, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, it's just a German document, I thought I'd put it up there. If you're asking, what is her relationship to National Socialism? Is she in things like the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Women's League, or the National Socialist People's Welfare Organization, as well as the German Red Cross? And all? These are Nazified institutions, of course. Absolutely she is. But again, you could ask, is she in those because she is politically astute and she recognizes, because she only joins in 1938, she's not joining in 1933. Is it political, or is it, no, I'm a full believer? Again, there's evidence both ways, and that very final point that I've just put up there at the bottom, it's a separate letter. It's talking about the news that the attack on Pearl Harbor has taken place. I'll just read the first line. She says, the first successes of the Japanese are fantastic and will inflict great pain on the English and the Americans as it strikes at their precious fleet and possessions overseas. I guess the point I'd make there is this is no bystander. There's been literature in the past that sometimes have talked about women, well, they're just, they're just everyday people, just getting on with their lives. They're not fighting at the front. They're certainly not running the death camps or anything. But again, we get an insight into one of these military wives. Oh, she's wishing great pain on English and Americans. She's involved in this war. She's emotionally supporting Heinz. She's absolutely in with both feet, and she's advising as best she can for Heinz to have the best possible career. And I think that kind of says it all for me. I'm not ambiguous at all about where I see these women. Even through the letters of the other German generals that we have, you become quite clear that they are, as the Germans might say, Mitmacher. They're very much on board with all of this process. So if some people are here for Heinz Guderian, well, let's deal with Heinz Guderian, and I'll try and be a little bit more to the point. The point I made before about, Heinz Guderian, does he need emotional support at all? Isn't he the great Panzer general? Look at the way he chooses to style himself, these very confident poses and so on. And he's very, very good at self-promotion. He knows what that world out there will want of him, and he performs for it. By the way, maybe a quick point on that. The celebrities of this era are not necessarily sporting or media personalities, singers and so on. Yes, there's a bit of that in the Third Reich. Media stars are generals, and that obviously fits with the National Socialist state of all warriors and so on, but it's also where that propaganda is faced. So German generals don't necessarily get promoted just based on, well, you would think they're good generals, right? That's the key. And actually what's going on, and what people like Guderian understand, and I'm a very critical man of Guderian on a lot of levels, not just because he's morally bankrupt as a very good Nazi, but because he's also a very poor general, I would say, on a lot of levels. What the man is actually quite brilliant at, along with people like Rommel, is self-promotion. He understands how that world works, and he plays to it very well. But that's not who he is. So if I just read one of these lines up there, it says, this is to Margarete in July of 1941, when the Eastern Front is going quite well. Oh, hang on, I've gotten ahead of myself. This is just talking about his love for Margarete. And it's another really important point that underscores who this guy is, and again, how important Margarete is. Allow me in thought to kiss you fervently on lips and hand, and to know that I am thinking of you in abiding love. Two things stand out there. I spent a lot of time studying letters of this era, not just by German generals, but I've done a whole separate book actually on German soldiers and looking at the theory behind this. This is exceptional language. People do not talk normally in this way. That's extremely sensual. And Guderian is an outlier in that sense. But what it does do is it tells us how important Margarete is, and he's, over this period, becoming not just depressed in a lot of different ways, and that's understandable given the way the campaign is going, but he is becoming, he feels extremely isolated, and he misses Margarete a great deal, and you can see that in the second quote there. And this final one on the screen, he's very explicit about it. He writes a lot about his emotions, more than the other German generals. Again, what he's writing to Margarete, this is now by October, so we're deep into the campaign. You can imagine how pleased I am that you empathize so fervently with me, despite the long separation, and that I have this one possibility to unburden my heart to another human being. So he's saying, I need that, and you're the one person. He does not do it with his sons. He hardly ever writes them. He has actually remarkably little interest in his sons. He doesn't even this is something I realized early in the campaign, he doesn't have their field post numbers. The only way to send a letter is with a field post number. And I can't remember when it is. I think it's the end of July. He finally writes to Margarete and says, oh, I don't have the boys' field post numbers. He's already been in the East for weeks before the invasion, and at no point has he ever thought to even write them. And then even much later, even when he's got this field post number, he keeps asking Margarete for information, so he doesn't really go to them. That might speak a lot to father-son relations at this time, but it also shows he's right. The person he unburdens himself is not to his staff, and there's no other fellow confidant there. It's very much Margarete. And the second part here, he's just basically talking to the fact that even though I'm surrounded by young people, they increasingly keep their distance. There's always that generational gap, as well as he's in command and all the rest of it. Now, the other thing I would talk about, if I'm trying to zero in on Heinz Guderian, and again, we only have so much time, is the operational side. I mean, I'm a guy who, as I've got these books up there, a little bit of self-promotion, please forgive it, but I'm trying to chart the fact that I've spent a lot of time charting these men as military figures, and I've written a lot about it. Part of the interesting thing for this book is, well, what do the letters reveal in that space? And one of the big things in there that I found just remarkable, and spent quite a bit of time talking about, are these things called operational silences. So we really get an insight. These guys share, as I said at the beginning, a remarkable amount of operational detail. They are not allowed to be talking about it. But these wives, all four of them, Schmidt, Herpener, Reinhardt, and Guderian are talking about things they should not be talking about, and in great detail. They're talking about personalities, talking about campaigns, sometimes even talk about plans. One thing I would have often thought, if the Allied intelligence ever wanted to try and get high-level information, they'd probably get domestic servants to work as spies in these homes, because actually it was very hard to get domestic servants at that time, to access these letters, because they were such rich sources of information and very unfiltered. And the bottom line here in that top little passage that I put up there is just basically to chart across all four of them. I haven't got this for Guderian specifically, but across all four of these generals, there are only 13 references to supply problems across all their letters for the back half of 1941. The collection is, off the top of my head, 130 plus letters. 13 instances. I think it's, what did I put there? Only 3 of them come before October. Now, anyone who knows anything about the Eastern Front knows one of the seminal problems that they face is logistical. It's remarkable how little of that is in the planning. It's remarkable how manifest that problem is. And yet, even in all the detail they're writing about, it sometimes becomes quite clear that the German generals aren't even writing about it. They have no real knowledge of it. And even though I put up one of the passages there, the long way and the various losses are very noticeable, as well as the fatigue, the horrendous dust scourge, the supply difficulties. He's not going on at great length. He's not spending a paragraph talking about where the railheads are, how they're not advancing. He doesn't talk about the trucks and all this. He just mentions it, right? It's remarkable to me that these men aren't spending more time on that. And I think that informs part of the problem. It's why I also said before, I'm not a fan of these men as generals. For all that they get about, oh, they're wonderful blitzkrieg people, well, that might be fine in France, but that's not what they've got in the Soviet Union. And they seem remarkably inept at identifying that. And then my bottom passage here, it just talks about the responsibility for the problems. And perhaps I won't go into that in terms of reading the piece there. People can read it for themselves. But the bottom line is, at the end of this 5.5 months of campaigning, and these men are autonomous, they make a lot of decisions for themselves, not everything is dictated from on high. It's remarkable when it's all starting to go wrong, the Soviets are on their counteroffensive, their ability to accept any responsibility is practically zero. They blame the high command, and that's kind of how it works throughout the chain. The divisional commanders are blaming the people who are at the corps or the panzer group level, and so it goes. Everyone just blames up the chain, but of course Hitler ultimately accepts zero responsibility, and that just means that part of the dysfunction of the German army is nobody's responsible. Nobody's accepting any responsibility. In fact, if you know about how Hitler ultimately, at the very end of the war, what does he do? He blames the German people. They weren't good enough. So the blame is on all sides. The German generals don't always blame their troops, although later in the war, some of them do, some of the more Nazified German generals, although I always struggle with more Nazified, as though some of them are less Nazified. They're all, on some level, very much on board with this. They are, after all, fighting for it. My final substantive slide here is taking us beyond just what the German generals may be or may not be as generals and as individuals, as private men, and speaks to, in some ways, what we should always use when we frame these men. People who are coming at the German generals, certainly in decades past, before there was a lot of good literature. The historiography has taken a long time, I think, to catch up with good literature about German generals. And there's good explanations for that, because one of the earliest pieces we had was Guderian's memoir, that book I put up on the screen there, Heinz Guderian's Panzer Leader. And you have to understand, when that came out in the early 50s, that's all we had. There was no archives. None of that stuff had been released. We wouldn't even get that to the 60s. So the narrative people had to try and understand who these men were people like Manstein and Guderian, and a whole plethora of them wrote memoirs, and they're uncritically accepted because there was no other context. But that also informs who these men were, because when it comes to that major issue of criminality and why I keep referring to them as Nazis, it's not just because they have Nazi Party membership, it's because of what they do, right? And the Eastern Front is informed by criminal orders. And if you take, for example, the Commissar order, where they kill the commissars, Guderian addresses that explicitly in the memoir, and he basically says, of course, I didn't pass that on. I saw exactly what that was, and no, that's not what the German army does. Except that's not what the historiography tells us. For decades, people were inclined to believe that, but then some of the people who've done amazing works, and I'd call out Felix Römer here and his work. He's the guy who spent, I think, 2 years in the German archive just reading all the files. Now, there's not many people I would believe who could do that, because again, the scale of that undertaking would be enormous. But again, I met him in the time. He was. I said to him, "What are you doing?" He's going to read it all. He's going to read it all in 1941 and into 1942 in order to conclusively answer how many of these German divisions across the Eastern Front ever implemented this. And the bottom line is 80% he finds conclusive evidence that they're implementing this. It's up to 90 if you take suggestive evidence in 10%, and then in the final 10%, there's just no evidence. It doesn't mean they didn't do it, but they just don't write about it. And you have to remember, sometimes the files are thin. In some units, they're just thin. In some of them, they just talk about weather and things. There's not a lot to go on. What does that mean for Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group in terms of this implementation of criminal orders? Well, if we take the Commissar order, because there's multiple criminal orders, it is categorical from Romer's research that between the 22nd of June and 31st of October, 196 commissars are killed. Well, we have explicit evidence of this happening. In other words, did Guderian pass that on? Absolutely, he did. Is it happening in his Panzer Group? Yes, it's happening in the corps, it's happening in the divisions. It's ubiquitous. And so we shouldn't perhaps be surprised, very much deliberate lies in Heinz Guderian's memoir. And as a final point, if anyone's interested in Felix Romer's work, of course it's a German book, it's never been translated. It's one of the ones that should get translated, but it won't, I suspect. It's very big, and it's now 10, 15 years out of date, so I don't know how attractive that is to publishers. But there is a chapter, I'm not trying to call out my own work here, but I did this book with two other historians, and it's all about Nazi policy on the Eastern Front, and Felix has a chapter there in English talking about his work, which is well worth reading. And at that, I think I will say thank you very much, and any questions?
Well, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. The letters between Guderian and his wife certainly provide a really unique perspective into their relationship and into the way that I guess she could support his war from the home front. So thank you for sharing with that. I would like to ask, what do German people know about Panzer generals nowadays, and is it something that they teach in schools?
Oh, that's such a good question. Remarkably little, I would say. And people might say, oh, Germans don't do their history. They absolutely do history. In fact, you can't go to a German university without doing X number of years of history. It's not like Australia where history is just seen as optional. In Germany, it's absolutely core. So you must do it. And do they do anything on that period? Certainly 1933 to 1945, they do a great deal. So, but it's a lot about the rise to power. It's a lot about the Nazi state. It's remarkably little about the Second World War. So I guess one of the things that they're still dealing with, and every country's dealing with its own history, is, and I think this is what they're grappling with, is it possible that we're learning the wrong lessons by doing military history? And should we be touching that, especially when there's all this criminality to explore? I don't claim to answer that for Germans, but I think the one thing I would say as a bottom line, and certainly the narrative I've given a few times when I've spoken there, is because people have critically questioned, there's this focus on operations and things, David, isn't that sort of beside the point? There is a definite link between, if you want to understand the radicalization of Nazi policy in terms of annihilation, there is a link between that process and the progress of the war. But if you don't study the progress of the war, you can't fully understand how the Holocaust begins and how the war of annihilation progresses. In other words, one goes with the other. So it's super important, but I think slowly things are changing. There is more scope to do and understand military history without seeing it as being some kind of way that Germans would fight war better, or some sort of distraction from Nazi criminality. I think you can have both. So yeah, but good question.
Of course, there's many important lessons that we can learn from history, so I'm glad to hear that there is some approaches to that as well. I was wondering as well, in the start of your presentation, you spoke a little bit about things that were disclosed in the letters between Guderian and his wife. What might the consequences have been if they had been sort of found out to be sharing highly confidential information for people of their sort of social standing?
Yeah, that's another good question. I don't actually know of an instance where somebody is revealed to be doing this and then what kind of consequences they face. I think their caution is probably informed by information is a commodity, especially if you're jockeying for position at the high levels and you need to be seen to be, absolutely loyal. That is the number one thing. Loyalty over competence, I would also add. And they're very aware of that. And I think that's what they see the problem as being. But at the same time, I might just add, if you were to use your letters to imply any criticism, and actually one of my other Panzer generals in 1943, Schmidt, who's writing with his brother, and he does criticize I don't know how explicit it is of Hitler, but he's talking about the senior leadership. Now, the problem is he's already extremely senior. He's an army commander by that point. And so when he says senior leadership, it doesn't get much more senior. And it turns out that Schmidt's brother is a spy. So he's been working for the Allies, which already is deeply problematic and questions everything. And then when you've got this general in the Eastern Front saying this, so that ends Schmidt's career. Schmidt does try to rebuild that career. He's again, these guys are operators, right? And he starts to realize, well, okay, I've committed a problem. And he's got strong relations with people like even Himmler, which also speaks to how Nazified these guys are. And he's exploiting that relationship. Apparently Himmler makes 3 attempts on Schmidt's behalf to get him some kind of position again. Himmler's even going to trade his political capital with Hitler. So maybe you're never beyond redemption, even when you've been that far indicted. But then on the other hand, Schmidt never does restore his career. So there are consequences, but it's very much the exception to the rule to be sort of caught out for doing that thing.
Of course, and you'd want to be very careful, but nevertheless, these letters are fascinating, I should say, and provide an amazing insight into the lives of these men. And maybe just to finish up as well, David, I might just ask you, what sort of research are you working on next?
Great. I love talking about research. I'll try and keep this very short. Look, the ideas aren't fully formed, but as the guy who, I think as people have just seen, has been spending a lot of time in 1941, now early 1942, people sort of say I'm the most predictable guy because why not just carry on with the next part? And there was a temptation to do that. But I am now deliberately going to try and do something very different and look at the summer of 1944 and particularly the destruction of Army Group Center. It's a big Soviet offensive at that time. People are probably aware of it. But what I want to focus on is the German collapse. So I think almost all the books largely focus on the Soviet side because that's where the records are. And if the big question is, well, do we have any German records? No, that's part of the problem. And then maybe I'll leave it for another day. Maybe we'll be back in a few years if I can finish that book and talk about what that German source material is. But I found a bit of a goldmine of German source material with which to reconstruct that event. And so working on that. Wish me luck.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. And of course, we do wish you all the best with your research, David.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for taking the time to have a chat with us today. And thank you to those of you at home for watching. Our next webinar will be in the new year. And for now, we wish all of our viewers a safe and enjoyable Christmas break. Thank you and until next time.